There are places in history so horrifying, people convince themselves they can't possibly be real. Because real doctors don't freeze human beings alive just to measure how long it takes the flesh to die. Real scientists don't infect prisoners with disease, then calmly document the results like lab notes. Real governments don't build entire facilities dedicated to human experimentation, then spend decades pretending they barely existed at all. Hidden in occupied China during World War II behind military checkpoints and official paperwork, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a secret research facility known today as Unit 731. Officially, it was called a water purification department. In reality, it became one of the darkest human experimentation programs in recorded history. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: nobody who entered those prison cells ever came back out again. No survivors stepped forward from inside the laboratories. No prisoners lived to tell the full story of what happened behind those walls. What we know today was pieced together from burned records, scattered testimony, wartime documents, and the quiet admissions of some of the men who worked there themselves. Because even after the war ended, the world didn't rush to expose Unit 731. In some ways, it helped bury it. Welcome to The Quiet Work, a Meals to Unalive For series. By the 1930s, the world was already beginning to slide toward another global war. Imperial Japan had expanded aggressively across Asia, eventually occupying large parts of China, including the region known then as Manchuria. The war was brutal long before most of the world would fully understand just how brutal it had become. Entire towns disappeared into military occupation, civilians lived under constant surveillance, and across the occupied territories, the Japanese military began establishing research divisions focused on everything from disease prevention to battlefield medicine to biological warfare. One man in particular quickly gained influence inside those programs: Shiro Ishii. Ishii was a military doctor, intelligent, ambitious, and deeply fascinated by the potential of biological weapons. At the time, much of the world feared chemical and biological warfare after the devastation of World War I. International agreements attempted to restrict those kinds of weapons, but fear rarely stops nations from researching them in secret. And in occupied China, secrecy was very easy to find. Near Harbin, in the district of Pingfang, construction began on what outwardly appeared to be a military medical and water purification facility. Officially, it operated under the name the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. A title that sounded clinical, bureaucratic, even helpful. But behind guarded gates and heavily restricted buildings, the facility continued expanding year after year into something far larger than most nearby civilians understood. Laboratories, barracks, rail lines, crematoriums, prisons. Thousands of personnel eventually worked within the complex, and despite its official cover story, rumors slowly began spreading through the surrounding areas that something deeply wrong was happening inside. To understand how Unit 731 became possible, it helps to understand the man behind it. Shiro Ishii was born in Japan in 1892 and later studied medicine at Kyoto Imperial University, one of the most prestigious schools in the country at the time. Even early on, accounts from classmates and colleagues often described him as intensely confident, sometimes to the point of arrogance. But he was also undeniably intelligent. Ishii specialized in microbiology and bacteriology, fields focused on microscopic organisms, infection, and disease. In another life, those studies might have led toward ordinary medical research: vaccines, public health, treatment. Instead, Ishii became fascinated by the military potential of disease. During the years following World War I, much of the world had grown terrified of chemical and biological warfare. International treaties attempted to ban their use entirely, but according to later accounts, Ishii interpreted those bans differently. If the world feared biological weapons enough to outlaw them, then they must be powerful. That belief would shape the rest of his career. Ishii reportedly traveled through Europe and studied foreign research programs connected to biological warfare and military medicine. When he returned to Japan, he began aggressively promoting the idea that the Japanese Empire needed its own advanced biological weapons program before other nations perfected theirs first, and somehow he managed to convince the right people. Military leadership saw the potential in him. Funding followed, influence followed, protection followed. Former descriptions of Ishii often paint a strange picture. Not a raving madman screaming in laboratories, but a polished military officer. Educated, controlled, socially skilled, a man who reportedly hosted parties, drank heavily, cultivated connections, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed history would eventually prove him right, which may be one of the most unsettling details of him of all, because history rarely looks dangerous while it's happening. Usually, it looks organized. And as Shiro Ishii gained influence with the Imperial Japanese military, the facility at Pingfang continued expanding alongside him. What began outwardly as a disease prevention and water purification department slowly evolved into a massive hidden complex operating behind layers of military secrecy. Near Harbin, entire sections of the area became restricted. Guard towers rose around the compound, rail lines connected parts of the facility to the outside world. New laboratory buildings, barracks, prison blocks, administrative offices all continued appearing year after year. To nearby civilians, the true purpose of the complex remained intentionally unclear. Official explanations described medical research, disease prevention, and water sanitation. But rumors spread constantly. Locals reportedly spoke of prisoners arriving under heavy guard, of strange odors drifting from parts of the compound, of smoke rising at odd hours, of people entering the facility but never returning. And inside the walls, secrecy became part of everyday life. Former accounts suggest many workers were intentionally kept separated from the full scope of operations. Personnel often understood only fragments of what neighboring departments were doing. Others understood far more and continued their work in silence. Doctors worked beside military officers, researchers beside prison guards. Clerks documented reports while trains continued bringing supplies and prisoners into the expanding complex. By the late 1930s, Unit 731 had reportedly grown into one of the largest biological warfare research facilities in the world. Thousands of personnel were connected to the program in some capacity, including scientists, surgeons, veterinarians, engineers, soldiers, and support staff. And as the compound expanded, so did the language used inside it. According to later testimony from former personnel, prisoners were frequently referred to as maruta, or as we would say in English, logs. Some accounts claim the term originated from the facility's cover story, helping disguise prisoner transport and activity as part of a lumber operation. But over time, the word seemed to become something else entirely, because language has a way of reshaping morality. Once people become logs, they stop sounding human, and inside Unit 731, that dehumanization became deeply woven into the daily operation of the facility itself. Prisoners reportedly lost their names. Records categorized them by infections, injuries, experiment schedules, or numbers. And behind locked doors hidden from the outside world, the experiments were becoming increasingly extreme. As Unit 731 expanded, prisoners continued arriving at the facility under heavy guard. Many were taken from occupied regions of China, though records and testimony also point to Korean prisoners, Soviet prisoners, American prisoners, resistance fighters, suspected spies, political prisoners, and ordinary civilians accused of anti-Japanese activity. Some were arrested without trial, others simply disappeared into military custody and were never seen again. Exact numbers remain difficult to confirm even today. Records were intentionally destroyed near the end of the war, and much of what historians know has been reconstructed from testimony, surviving military documents, and post war investigations. Once prisoners entered Unit 731, none ever left alive. Inside the compound, prisoners were stripped of identity almost immediately. Names reportedly disappeared from the records, replaced with the numbers, experiment categories, or the term Maruta. Former personnel would later describe an environment where human beings were spoken about less like prisoners and more like materials being processed through a system. Researchers documented infections, injuries, temperatures, and reactions with clinical precision. Reports were written in technical language, procedures were scheduled, results were archived. Everything about the environment encouraged attachment, which may explain how so many people inside the facility managed to continue participating in what was happening there, because cruelty often becomes easier when wrapped in procedure. Former accounts suggest that certain prisoners were kept alive only as long as they remained useful for ongoing experiments. Others reportedly disappeared after specific tests had been completed. Pregnant women were also imprisoned. Children were imprisoned. Entire families are believed to have vanished into military custody without relatives ever learning where they had gone. And outside the walls of Unit 731, nearby civilians often understood only fragments of the truth. But wartime fear, military control, and secrecy kept most people from ever learning exactly what was happening behind the guarded gates of Pingfang. Meanwhile, inside the laboratories, the experiments themselves were becoming increasingly extreme. Inside the laboratories at Pingfang, prisoners were infected with illnesses including plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, tuberculosis, and syphilis. Some prisoners were injected directly. Others were reportedly exposed through contaminated food, water, fleas, or deliberate exposure to infected materials. Researchers then documented the progression of disease in extraordinary detail: fever progression, organ failure, internal bleeding, time until death. According to post war testimony and surviving records, the experiments were designed not to heal the patients but to observe untreated human suffering from beginning to end. Former Unit 731 member Yoshio Shinozuka would later describe participating in plague related operations and eventually admitted the memories stayed with him for decades afterwards. In later interviews, some former personnel attempted to justify the work as wartime necessity, others spoke with visible discomfort, and some described becoming emotionally numb inside the environment of the facility itself. Former military nurse Toyo Ishii reportedly recalled witnessing prisoners suffering from deliberate infection experiments while staff continued documenting symptoms clinically around them. One former member later admitted, at first, some resisted, but gradually they became accustomed to it. And that's one of the more terrifying details connected to Unit 731. Not simply the experiments themselves, but how ordinary routine seemed to form around them. Doctors took notes, assistants prepared the instruments, reports were filed, meals were eaten, and somewhere behind locked doors, prisoners died from diseases intentionally inflicted upon them in the name of research. But for researchers at Unit 731, infection alone was not enough. They wanted to observe the human body from the inside, and that led to some of the most infamous experiments ever connected to the facility. As the experiments continued, researchers inside Unit 731 reportedly became increasingly focused on observing the internal effects of disease and injury on the human body in real time. And that led to one of the most horrifying practices associated with the facility: vivisection. Prisoners were dissected alive without anesthesia. According to testimony after the war, researchers believed anesthesia would interfere with results by altering the body's natural reactions. The goal was observation, not treatment. Former personnel and investigators described prisoners being restrained to tables while surgeons removed organs, amputated limbs, or examined the progression of disease inside the body while the victim was still alive. Some prisoners reportedly had organs deliberately removed for comparison studies. Others were subjected to experimental surgeries after infection with plague, cholera, or other diseases being studied inside the facility. Accounts also describe cases where limbs were amputated and reattached to opposite sides of the body, or where organs were removed simply to observe how long a human being could survive afterward. Accounts connected to Unit 731 also include experiments involving pregnant prisoners. Some women were infected with diseases, so researchers could study the transmission effects on both mother and unborn child. Others were subjected to vivisection during pregnancy, as military doctors observed the progression of infection, internal damage, and trauma in real time. One witness recalled a pregnant victim, when cut open, pleading to save her child, yet the fetus was still dissected afterwards. Even within the broader history of Unit 731, these experiments remain among the most horrifying details ever connected to the facility. And through it all, researchers documented everything: measurements, temperatures, the blood loss, organ deterioration, clinical notes written with the detached tone of an ordinary lab work. Former Unit 731 member Yoshio Shinozuka would later admit that personnel inside the facility were becoming emotionally desensitized to what they were witnessing. In later interviews, he spoke openly about the guilt he carried for decades afterward and described the memories as something that never fully left him. Another former member, Moritaka Kimura, reportedly recalled that many workers initially struggled psychologically when first exposed to the experiments, but over time, the environment inside the compound normalized the brutality around them. After a while, Kimura later explained, it became routine. That normalization appears again and again throughout testimony connected to Unit 731. and many of the people participating were not uneducated men dragged randomly into violence. They were trained doctors, surgeons, researchers, men who had once studied medicine, a profession built around preserving life, now using those same skills to deliberately destroy it. Former Army Doctor Mikio Oka would later describe the atmosphere inside the facility as one where moral resistance gradually eroded beneath military obedience, secrecy, and repetition. Some former personnel later expressed guilt publicly after the war. Others denied involvement entirely, and many reportedly remained silent for decades. But silence became increasingly difficult as more testimony kept emerging about what happened inside the labs at Pingfang. Because the experiments were not limited to disease and surgery alone. Researchers at Unit 731 also became obsessed with the effects of extreme environmental suffering on the human body, especially frostbite. Among the most infamous experiments connected to Unit 731 were the frostbite studies. Researchers wanted to understand exactly how the human body reacted to extreme cold, particularly for military operations in harsh winter environments. Prisoners were taken outside in freezing temperatures or had their limbs deliberately exposed to ice in sub zero conditions until the flesh froze solid. Former member Yoshimiru Hisato later became closely associated with these experiments and research into cold exposure. Accounts describe limbs being submerged in freezing water, exposed to winter air, or repeatedly frozen and thawed while researchers observed the damage in detail. And according to multiple accounts and later testimony, the prisoners used in these experiments were not just limited to the adult men. Women were also subjected to the procedures and children as well. Some accounts and investigations also allege infants were among the victims held inside this facility, which makes the details surrounding the frostbite experiments even more difficult to comprehend. Some former personnel described how researchers confirmed a limb had frozen completely by striking it with a stick or a rod. Apparently, the sound produced by the frozen flesh was reported to be compared to the sound of striking wood. Once severe frostbite had developed, prisoners were subjected to additional procedures intended to study progression, methods of treatment, or the body's reaction to thawing. Some limbs were deliberately thawed with hot water, others with fires or different temperature exposures, while researchers documented tissue damage, gangrene, infection, and deterioration. And like so much of Unit 731's work, the experiments were recorded with the same clinical precision. Former personnel later described an environment where suffering had become transformed into data. The frostbite experiments became some of the clearest examples of how completely medicine inside Unit 731 had separated itself from ethics. Doctors were no longer trying to heal injuries, they were intentionally creating them. As the war intensified, Unit 731's research expanded beyond disease and frostbite experiments into direct weapons testing on living prisoners. Prisoners were tied to wooden stakes at measured distances while grenades were detonated nearby so that researchers could study blast patterns, shrapnel wounds, burns, and again, survival rates. Doctors and military researchers reported how different distances affected the body, documenting the internal injuries, the blood loss, and organ damage after the explosions. Other prisoners were subjected to flamethrower tests, gunshot wounds, bayonet injuries, and pressure chamber experiments intended to study how the human body reacted under extreme physical conditions. There were also dehydration and starvation experiments designed to measure survival limits and battlefield endurance. Some personnel later admitted that parts of the weapons testing were initially treated almost like demonstrations or technical exercises inside the facility, and observers later also reportedly viewed some explosion experiments with fascination or even entertainment during the early stages of testing. That detail appears repeatedly throughout accounts surrounding the facility. In some cases, prisoners who survived initial injuries were used for additional procedures afterwards so researchers could continue studying the progression of trauma and infection. They also describe pressure chamber experiments in which prisoners were exposed to extreme atmospheric pressure until eyes protruded, blood vessels ruptured, or organs failed. There's also reports that they were spun in centrifuges, exposed to prolonged dehydration, or left without food and water so military doctors could record the body's deterioration over time. But by this point, Unit 731 had evolved far beyond a secret medical research facility. It had become a military program focused on turning human suffering into battlefield data, and eventually, the Imperial Japanese military began moving those experiments beyond the prison compound itself and into surrounding civilian populations. By the later years of the war, Unit 731's work had expanded far beyond the laboratories at Pingfang. The Imperial Japanese military wanted to know whether biological weapons could be used against real populations on a massive scale, and parts of occupied China became testing grounds. One of the methods involved plague infected fleas. Researchers inside Unit 731 bred enormous quantities of fleas carrying bubonic plague bacteria, then packed them into specially designed ceramic bombs. Unlike metal explosives, the ceramic casings shattered in a way that allowed many of the infected fleas to survive dispersal after impact. Aircraft connected to the program dropped plague infected fleas, contaminated grain, and disease carrying materials across towns in rural regions in occupied China. Wells and water supplies were also contaminated during some operations. Soon afterwards, outbreaks of plague, cholera, typhoid, and other diseases began spreading through civilian populations. Entire villages became sick within days. Families died without understanding why disease was suddenly tearing through their communities. Livestock collapsed, water became unsafe. Panic spread through already devastated wartime regions. Some estimates place the number of deaths connected to Japanese biological warfare operations in the tens of thousands, though the true number may never be fully known. One of the most heavily discussed operations took place during the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign following the Doolittle raid, after Chinese civilians helped American airmen escape. Disease outbreaks devastated parts of the region afterward, and in one of the cruel ironies surrounding Unit 731, some outbreaks eventually spread beyond their intended targets and infected Japanese troops as well. Disease, once released, could not always be controlled. Inside Unit 731, entire sections of facilities were dedicated to breeding infected fleas for deployment. They studied how quickly outbreaks spread through the community, how weather affected transmission, and how effectively disease moved through civilian populations after release. By this point, the work at 731 had become far more than experimentation. It was active biological warfare. And while much of the outside world remained unaware of what was happening in occupied China, entire communities were already living through the consequences. Villages emptied, bodies accumulated, fear spread alongside the disease itself. But by the final years of World War II, Japan was beginning to lose the war. And inside Unit 731, the people running the facility understood that if Soviet or Allied forces reached Pingfang, everything hidden there risked being exposed. As Japan's situation in the war became increasingly desperate, some military leaders began considering whether Unit 731's biological weapons could be used against the United States itself. One proposed operation became known as Operation PX, or Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan involved Japanese submarines launching aircraft towards the American West Coast, carrying plague-infected fleas developed through Unit 731's research. Among the list of targets were cities like San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Some versions of the plan also involved submarine crews intentionally infecting themselves before coming ashore as part of what was essentially a suicide mission. By that point in the war, Japan was already collapsing under relentless bombing campaigns and military defeats across the Pacific, and inside parts of the Japanese military, desperation was beginning to outweigh restraint. But not everyone supported that plan. Yoshijiro Umezu, who served as chief of the Army General Staff, reportedly opposed the operation strongly enough that it was ultimately shelved before being carried out. Later, Umezu explained his reasoning with a statement that still feels unsettling decades later. If bacteriological warfare is conducted, it will grow from the dimension of war between Japan and America to an endless battle of humanity against bacteria. He also warned that Japan would become hated by the world if it unleashed that kind of attack. And for a brief moment, even some of the men helping oversee one of the history's most horrific biological warfare programs appeared to understand they were standing at the edge of something capable of spiraling far beyond the war itself. Because disease does not recognize borders. Once released, it spreads where it wants. In the end, Operation PX was never carried out. But the fact that it came as far as it did remains one of the most disturbing what-ifs of World War II. And while Japan debated increasingly desperate plans, Soviet forces were rapidly advancing towards Manchuria, which meant the people inside Unit 731 were running out of time to erase what they had been doing. In August of 1945, the war was collapsing around Japan. American bombing campaigns had devastated major cities. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as Soviet forces advanced rapidly into Manchuria, the people inside Unit 731 understood something terrifying was about to happen. The facility risked being captured, which meant the outside world could finally see what had been hiding inside Pingfang for years. Panic spread through the compound. Orders were issued to destroy evidence, eliminate remaining prisoners, and erase as much of the operation as possible before Soviet forces arrived. Buildings were blown apart, documents were burned, lab materials were destroyed. Prisoners still being held inside the facility were executed so no witnesses would remain. Some described the prisoners were just shot, others described poison, gas, or deliberate destruction of prison buildings with people still inside. Animals used for experimentation were killed as personnel abandoned the complex. Former members later testified that staff were ordered never to speak publicly about the program or their involvement in it. And then, many simply disappeared back into ordinary life. But despite the destruction, enough evidence survived for investigators to begin uncovering fragments of what happened inside Unit 731. Soviet forces captured some personnel connected to the program, leading to the Khabarovsk war crime trials, where testimony about biological warfare operations and human experimentation became public. But another decision was quietly unfolding behind the scenes, because as World War II ended, the Cold War was beginning. And as we discussed with Operation Sea Spray in an earlier episode, the US had become deeply interested in biological warfare research as well. American intelligence officials and military researchers understood that Unit 731 possessed years of human experimentation data that no other country had gathered. Data gathered through atrocities so extreme that many researchers elsewhere would never have been willing or able to replicate them. And instead of aggressively prosecuting many of the people involved, the United States chose another path: immunity. In exchange for research data, interviews, experimental results, and cooperation, many figures connected to Unit 731 avoided prosecution for war crimes. Shiro Ishii himself was never tried for war crimes connected to Unit 731, even though he ran the entire operation. Neither were many of the doctors, researchers, or military personnel who had participated in the program. Some returned to medicine. Some entered business or academia, such as the former Major General and second commander of the unit, Masaji Kitano, and Ryoichi Naito, who would found the Green Cross Corporation, Japan's first commercial blood bank, eventually merging into Mitsubishi Pharma today. Sounds fine and dandy until you find out that they were part of another scandal where over 3,000 Japanese civilians contracted HIV through their products that were known to be unsafe at the time. Others lived quietly for decades without publicly discussing what had happened inside the facility. For many years, large parts of the story remained buried underneath the Cold War secrecy, destroyed records, political interests, and silence from those involved. And the silence may be one of the most unsettling parts of Unit 731's legacy, because when most people imagine evil, they imagine chaos, rage, violence out in the open. But Unit 731 looked organized, professional, scientific. Men in uniforms filling out reports, doctors recording observations, researchers discussing data while human beings disappeared behind locked doors. The horror wasn't hidden inside monsters, it was hidden behind systems, inside procedure, inside ordinary people slowly convincing themselves that if something could be measured, it could also be justified. Today, some of the buildings remain in just small fragments in Pingfang. Museums and memorials now stand where secrecy once ruled the compound, but the legacy of Unit 731 remains deeply uncomfortable for a reason. Because it forces people to confront the reality that some of history's worst atrocities were not committed in moments of madness, but in carefully organized rooms by educated people who went to work each morning believing they were serving a greater purpose. And long after the labs were destroyed, the questions left behind never disappeared. For decades after World War II ended, large parts of the story surrounding Unit 731 were buried beneath the silence, destroyed records, Cold War politics, public denial, you name it. Many people outside Asia had never heard of the name, and for years, discussion of the program inside Japan itself remained limited, controversial, or heavily avoided altogether. Some personnel stayed silent for the rest of their lives, others denied involvement entirely. Families of victims often never learned what happened to relatives who disappeared into the military compound during the war. Many of the people responsible for one of the largest biological warfare and human experimentation programs in modern history were never publicly tried for those crimes. The US wanted the research. Russia wanted the research. And as the Cold War began, American intelligence officials saw Unit 731's data as militarily valuable, particularly the information gathered through plague research, frostbite studies, disease transmission, biological warfare testing. In exchange for access to that research, immunity was quietly offered to many of the people involved. Even the 12 members that Russia had captured were offered the exact same deals for releasing their research to them. Which means that while the world remembers the Nuremberg trials and other war crime prosecutions after World War II, many of the men connected to Unit 731 avoided anything. And more units have been found to have done the same procedures all over Asia. Unit 100, 1644, 1855, 8604, 9420, 516, and the list goes on, all under the guise of epidemic prevention and water supply facilities with no way to tell how many were tortured in the grand scheme of things. The decision to grant immunity still leaves a bitter stain on the history surrounding the program, because it raises a question that remains difficult to answer even now. What does it say about the world when governments decide that data gathered through human suffering is still valuable enough to protect the people who did it? The labs at Pingfang were destroyed, the records were burned, the prisoners were executed, but the legacy of Unit 731 never disappeared. It survived in testimony and confessions that came decades later, and in the uncomfortable realization that some of history's darkest atrocities were not hidden because nobody knew about them, but because powerful people decided there were reasons not to look too closely. Unit 731 was never just a story about human experimentation. It was a story about what governments are willing to excuse when something becomes strategically valuable enough. Thousands of people disappeared into labs, prison cells, operating rooms, and mass graves, and in the end, many of the men responsible walked away with immunity because the data they collected was considered more important than the lives they destroyed to obtain it. That's the part people struggle to sit with. Not just what happened inside Unit 731, but the realization that after everything was uncovered, powerful governments still looked at the results and said, "We want the research." The facilities may be destroyed, the records may be gone, and the witnesses may have been executed, but some things never really disappear, especially when the people responsible were never forced to answer for them.